Hi, I'm Mary Hoover from 4th and 6th Designs, and I'm here to introduce you to Solstice, our third block of the month. So this is going to be very winter oriented. It's only 5 blocks and it'll be a 6-month block of the month. And I'm going to show you some of the tips for each block. So we're going to start with block number 1. And in our first set of videos for our first block of the month, Full Bloom, we went through step by step our applique technique process. This will be an overview or a recap of that technique. So we're going to start again with block number 1, and let's take a look at it. So this block, we call it breakfast. It's a cardinal and his friend having breakfast. And this block is 48.5 by 18.5 when it's trimmed. The finished size in the quilt is 48 by 18. So the first thing we do with any block that we're appliquing is to make a tracing paper rendition of it. So this is what this is. Trace the entire block, adding our dash lines and numbering system. And this will be used as a reference for placing all the pieces as they're appliqued. And this is the actual block. Just as a reminder, the dotted lines or the dash lines that you see on each of the pattern pieces are just to remind you that there are pattern pieces that lay on top of each other and behind each other. It's the same thing. So as you're drawing this line for the bottom snow section of this block, it continues behind the bird, so that's just one continuous line. This piece number 10 is going to be up under piece number 12, so you just need to cut that piece a little bit larger. And also remember that each piece of the pattern has its own piece of freezer paper. So as you trace this out onto freezer paper, each number piece is its own individual pattern piece on freezer paper. And now I'm going to show you what that looks like as we iron them onto the actual pieces we're using for the quilt. These are the fabrics that we used for the sample. They are from the Solstice line that we designed for Island Batik, and each one of these will have the reference number included in the pattern. So typically when you cut your shapes out of the freezer paper, you're going to have a little bit of paper beyond the edge of the actual pattern piece, and that is what will get ironed on to the good side of your fabrics. So the reason I showed you this first is because I don't want you to be confused when you look at these actual pattern pieces. These are the pattern pieces we used to make our sample. So they've already been used and cut out for one complete quilt. And the freezer paper doesn't really get used up, so you can use them time and again. And I didn't want to cut out an entire quilt again, so I'm reusing these pieces. But remember, as I said, typically you're going to have a little bit of paper beyond your cutting line. Now the reason I'm showing you this is because when you get this fabric for the background of block number 1, it's going to be enough fabric for the entire quilt. So what you're seeing here are the pieces for where this fabric is used in blocks 1 through 5. When I trace each pattern piece from the original onto freezer paper, I'll write the block number so I can use it again, and the pattern piece number. So that's what you see all this writing on here about. Block number 1, breakfast, which is the cardinal block. This is the entire sky piece. So when you iron this on to this gray dot, try to keep it up to the top or bottom, however you're referencing it right now, so that you have plenty of room for this large piece, which you'll get in that you'll need for block number 2. And then you'll have this section here and all down here that you can use, or the remaining blocks. So this is the sky for block number 1. and you'll see that it was cut roughly, you know, there's no exact measurement, it's just cut bigger than the actual pattern piece. I'm only going to peel back this section down here. This needs to stay on until we're ready to cut the entire thing exactly on the line, but we have to put the trees on first. So using my tracing paper that we've made for the complete block, you're going to line up your sky snow line right along that edge so you know you have the right placement. And you could use your dressmaker's weights or anything that's weighted to hold down your tracing paper. And notice that the freezer paper is just peeled back enough so that we can put the trees on. For each block, you'll notice that each pattern piece has a number, and that is the order in which they are appliqued. For block number 1, the background sky didn't have a number because it's obvious what that is. So our block piece number 1 would be this tree. Now when you iron your freezer paper pieces onto the fabrics and then cut them out, cutting right on the drawn line, remember to leave your freezer paper on, and remember that this is the good side. So when you slide this between the tracing paper and the background, the paper side will be up. And you're just going to fit that in so it falls exactly where it's been drawn. And remember that it's going to be a little bit below the snow because it's going to get caught in that seam allowance. I'm just going to place this exactly where I need it to be. And now I know that it's placed properly, I'm actually going to glue this piece. Now I'm just going to move this tracing paper out of the way, and we'll do a little recap of our gluing technique. So keeping this placed perfectly without disturbing it, I'm just going to fold back a section and run a thin bead of glue right at the very edge. And let me zoom in so that you can see exactly what that looks like. So I'm going to go all the way around this section, and we use Roxanne's glue. We use Roxanne's glue Baste-it as our basting glue. I'm going to fold that down, and as I press it, a little bit of the glue will squeeze out, which is actually a good thing. You want that to happen because you want that to seal the edge. The nice thing about this glue is it will not gum up your needle. It dries clear. It's archival safe, and it actually is used by hand appliqueurs for doing Hawaiian applique. And that's who it was developed by. It will wash out when you wash the quilt, and it does not interfere with your needle whatsoever. So as you begin to stitch this down, you'll notice that your needle doesn't even know that it's there. So I'm going to finish gluing this tree and then we'll move on. So a tip that we give is that when you are tracing each of your shapes onto the freezer paper, remember to use an extra fine Sharpie or a fine Sharpie marker pen, because if you use pencil, when you go to smooth out the glue is wet and will smear the pencil if you use it. So that's why we use a pen. By the time you get to the end of your shape, whatever it is, the glue is typically dry. Wait just a few more seconds and then remove the freezer paper so that you're not gluing the freezer paper to your fabric. Now after I've removed the freezer paper, now I'm ready to stitch. But before I do that, I need to add some stabilizer to the back of this piece so that it doesn't scrunch up when I do the stitching. And all the stitching tutorial you can find in our first block of the month, block number 1 of Full Bloom, under Edge Coloring Applique. You can search YouTube for that and see exactly how we do our stitching. So typically now this piece would be stitched, it would be pressed, and then I'd go on to then place piece number 2. So that just happens by putting the tracing paper shape back on top, lining it up exactly like we did the first time. And now let's put on piece number 2. So it's the same procedure for each piece. You're just going to go in the numbering order, starting with piece number 1, and then piece number 2. And you'll notice that piece number 2, the edge of that gets covered by piece number 4. So that's why you'll see it behind piece number 4. So I'm going to glue this down now, remove the paper, and then I would stitch it. So now I'm placing piece number 3 in its position. I'm going to glue that, remove the paper, stitch it, press it, and then put all this back on so I can put on pieces 4, 5, and then lastly goes on number 6. So I've added all of the trees, and remember on yours these will all be stitched before you continue. Now I'm going to replace this piece of freezer paper and press it so it's nice and tight, and then I'm going to cut along this cut edge so I have the right edge for the sky where it meets the snow. So I'm going to now cut this snow section for block number 1 away from so I can leave the rest of this. Now you're not going to have all these pieces on here until you do those blocks, so don't be confused by that. I want to do a rough cut, so I'm not going to cut directly on this line that I drew from the pattern. I'm just going to cut it out outside the drawn line. So this will be one of the few times that we actually use the paper pattern for placement and not the tracing paper. So the first thing I'll do is take my sky piece, which is the piece I just cut that directly matches the pattern, removed the freezer paper, and I'm going to lay it on top of the paper pattern. I'm going to line it up because I can see the lines perfectly and I know where it needs to go. And then I want to take my snow piece, I removed the freezer paper after I did a rough cut, and I'm just going to sneak it under so that I can make sure that it's completely covered by the sky. And clearly using a large flat surface is the best way to get this job done. So just make sure that it's completely covered. And now we're just going to leave this in place and glue the edge of the sky to the snow. So I'm just going to begin to glue. Single bead of glue like we did before. Remembering not to disturb this large piece as you glue it. So just fold back and try to do small sections at a time. Now I know this might seem a little crazy to do it this way, but we didn't want to piece this. We want it to have an organic line separating the sky from the snow, and we didn't want you to see the sky behind the snow. So that's why we chose to put these two pieces together this way. So I held my snow pieces down with my fabric weights, and I just finished gluing to the edge, to the end. And I want to take my paper out pretty much immediately because you don't want this to be glued to your pattern. So don't disturb it, leave it flat so it can dry completely, but just remove your paper. Okay, let's get on with the birds. And we think that this is looking a little distorted. It's only because this piece is so long. But just know it's one flat piece, it's not curved. So really what happens next is paint by numbers with fabric. You've cut out all your pieces. Now you just have to applique them in the order in which they are numbered. So this was number 7, which was the snow. Now 8 is this little guy's leg. So I'm going to fit that under there. And because this gets covered up by 9, 10, and 16, I'm going to glue it and stitch it. And then I'm going to move on to number 9. I'm going to glue it, stitch it, but remember to press in between. And then 10, 11 is his beak, and then 12. And then I'm going to move on to the rest, and the whole block will be complete. So remember, before we put the stabilizer only over here under the trees, because that's where we were stitching. And you don't need to cover the whole thing on the back with stabilizer. You need to just cover where you're going to be stitching. So a piece, you know, about this big. So put that onto the back, you know, before you do all of your stitching. And when you're finished with the entire block and it's all trimmed to proper size, then remove the stabilizer. Here we have a completed block number 1. All of the pieces have been appliqued. Again, yours would be stitched. And a couple of things to point out. Whenever we're using the black, we tended to use the wrong side of the black so that the white dots weren't as bright. And whenever we're using some shadows from this piece of fabric, you can choose lighter and darker pieces. You can fussy cut from that fabric to get different levels of shading. So you can just play with that and pick the pieces you want. So trim this block to the measurement that is written in the pattern, and we're ready to start block number 2. Well, there you have it. That's block number 1. We hope you enjoy this project as much as we do. We're really proud of this quilt. You can look for our fabrics at your local quilt shop. The name of the fabric line is Solstice by Island Baste-it. You can look for matching threads from Orville. And after this, so there's 4 more blocks, and then month number 6 we have set aside for piecing the whole thing together, adding the sashing and the border, and then of course quilting it. All right, we'll see you back here next time.